So, hello and welcome to part 2 of the motion tuning series for the E6 HexMotion. This video is going to be entirely on the flight mode, and it's taken a bit longer than we had anticipated in the last video because we had to update our motor controllers as well to complement the flight code. This is the very first version of our flight mode, and even though in its current state it is a very good base and allows you a lot of adjustability, there are still a number of improvements that we need to do, and all of those planned improvements and sort of a quick development path into this we're going to get into at the end of the video. If you have any suggestions on your end, please feel free to tell us. We have a motion platform that has an excellent hardware capability in terms of its range and its responsiveness. What we're looking for now is to mature our motion algorithms by ourselves and also including your feedback to what can be done better, and then we can make those options available for you. Now let's just dive into the setup part of the video, and then the conclusion we're going to go over all of those steps. So now getting into the app, I'll go through all the changes that we've made, but unlike in the driving mode where we did a bit of explanation of everything, I think you have a sort of an overview of the app already. Selecting on our first page, we have our DCS and Microsoft Flight Sim, and for all the games that are not listed here, you can still use some telemetry as well, even for flight mode. Then we have made some changes to the GeForce tab. This I'm going to get to when we do the GeForce part. For now, what I'm going to do is I'll just set everything to 0. And even in layer 2, there are also some changes that we've made over here. For now, I'll also set all the scalings to 0. And then we go to layer 2 flight. This is probably the most important addition of the flight mode. So what we have here is everything related to orientation of the aircraft, plus all of the additional rotation rate. Now, when we start up, so you can see that we have absolute pitch and absolute roll limits. As you know, that our motion platform on its natural rotation point has a maximum of 15 degrees each side roll and a 15-degree pitch up and down. Pitch down is actually a bit more, but we sort of limit it because we're also using surge. On top, in orientation, we can set our absolute limits for those pitch and roll. First, I'll start off with orientation. We'll fly a bit, show you everything that is in the orientation, and then I'll show you what the washouts are, what the roll rates are, and then in the end what the vertical G's are. So I'm in the F-18 right now. I have all of these set to 0. Now all of these settings that you can see have a scale start, end, as well as a not start and end. What this does is that it allows you to change the behavior of the aircraft based on the airspeed. And for example, at the moment in orientation, we have a pitch start, which is 50. Then when you open the app, these knots are going to be at 990, which means that you only have to change the start value and the end value will have no effect. If I set this to, let's say, 200, and I set the end to 300, and I will set the scaling to 20. Now, what's going to happen at the start? My scale percentage is going to be 50%. Up until a value of 200 knots. Then from 200 knots to 300 knots, there's going to be a linear scale down to 20% scaling. And then from 300 knots onwards, it's going to stay at 20% scaling. How we sort of effectively utilize all of this, I'll get to in this flight demonstration as well, to figure out what scaling values we're actually using. The aircraft is going to have a peak of 90 degrees each side in roll, as well as a plus 90 and a minus 90 in pitch. Now, obviously, that is a bit impossible to map entirely on a motion platform. If I set this to 100%, and let's say I'll just keep these at 990 for now, because I only want to show you the scale effects. Okay, now one more thing. The rotation limit in orientation is 14, it's not 15. Reason being that when you get to that 14-degree angle, and you want to add a bit of a rotation rate effect on top of it. So let's say you're sitting at a 14-degree angle and now you want to map a bit of roll rate on top of it as well. So you have that 1 degree of headroom to model that roll rate as well, and you won't run into system saturation. The goal of all of this is that we want to achieve fluidity in motion. That is the most important thing when it comes to flight sims, far more than it is in driving sims. In flight sims, okay, not in fighter jets, but let's say if you're flying a World War II tail dragger or a helicopter, you would really feel if one of these actuators has actually come to its limits and all of the other 5 are moving. It's going to create a bit of a really unpredictable motion effect. So, and that is something that we're looking to avoid. So I've set everything to 0. I'll also set my smoothing to 0 for now. Let's just go for that. Let's see how the motion behaves one-to-one with the aircraft orientation And you'll also see in the telemetry signal when we run into saturation. So, right? And now if you can see, motion is like super responsive, and it's actually running into saturation quite a bit early. So, and even if I go to pitch, right? After that, I have absolutely, right? So after I do 15-degree pitch, I have absolutely no effect, run into motion saturation. Now to deal with this, we have this thing called nonlinearity. From in-game, we have the scale from 0 to 90, right? For pitch and roll both. And as soon as we hit 90 degrees, when we turn this nonlinearity up to 10, that 90 degrees end angle is going to be converted into 30 degrees. And in the middle, it stays sort of one-to-one to whatever scaling you've set. So what I prefer to do is to avoid running into this saturation situation. Oh, by the way, I did not set this to 0. This was really important. This had to be set to 0 as well. So I have nonlinearity to 10. That means that 90 degrees will now be converted to 30 degrees before it's sent to the motion platform. But still, we're running into a saturation issue, right? So what I will do is I'll set this to 45%. Now 45% of that 30 degrees means that now we sit within this 14-degree limit that we've set, right? So now you can see that the motion is behaving still, really one-to-one with the airplane, right? There's absolutely no delay, or the sense that I'm moving a bit less than what it should be. And if I go with a full 90-degree bank, and even if I do a pitch, let's do a pitch. Let's do a full roll. Right, so we do a full roll and then it comes down from the nose. Right, ooh, sorry, a full loop, not a full roll, a full loop. Okay. All right, and then I'm gonna do a pitch down. Okay, and then we'll come back up. So you still see that I run into a little bit of saturation. That's when the roll and pitch signal are both coming in together. It's really hard to avoid this, even though we have sort of a crossfade in the motion platform. And this crossfade, what it does is that if it's getting, let's say, 15 degrees of roll and 15 degrees of pitch at the same time, that's beyond the limits of the motion, either pure 15 degrees pitch or pure 15 degrees roll. So what we do is that we do a sort of a crossfade, and that what it does is that if both signals are coming in at 15 degrees max, it's going to reduce them down to 7.5 degrees. Now, what I recommend doing is that you set this 45% and nonlinearity at speeds in landing and takeoff situations. And as the speed increases, we sort of reduce the orientation scaling, because generally in flight dynamics, when you are at a bank, you will not feel this lateral vector in this direction. Your vertical G net vector is going to increase. Obviously, it's a lot immersive when you feel that constant clean angle. So what I generally tend to do is that, for example, for this airplane, I'm expecting takeoff speeds and landing transitions at around 220 knots. So I'm gonna set that here to 220 knots. And I want to blend it out into sort of a high speed mode, or normal flight mode. Let's have a 100 knot buffer in between. And we'll also set this N value to 10%. When I resume, and I'm at 400 knots at the moment, and I've put my throttle back to 0. So at 330 knots, you can see that I'm still at 350. This is still above that 320 knot limit. Oh, by the way, I think I made a mistake. The roll rate and pitch rates are still active. We only want to view the orientation. So I'm still at 330 knots, and now you can see the orientation only the orientation, so that's only at 10%. So you still get a little bit of that effect. And how we fill in these effects, we're going to do that with the roll rate and pitch rate. For now, let's just bleed off our speed. So we're now at 220, 230 knots, and our scaling has started coming up, right? Actually, we're now not running into a bit of saturation. So now that I've shown you, the blend without the pitch and roll rate, I'm going to turn this up again to 45. So we can, I will show you a bit better how it does when we approach. It's going to go down, gain some airspeed. Right, and now at 550 knots, as you can see, I'm not running into a lot of saturation issues. There's still, might be some. And by the way, when we do an inverted roll, we try to bring it back to 0 when we're at minus 180, so that we don't have this brutal transition going from plus 180 to minus 180. So now we'll get to the point where we create a sort of a useful blend between high speed and low speed flying. For now, I'm going to set this to 0 so I can show you all of those roll rate and pitch rate effects as well. So let's go with a similar scaling. So let's go with 220, and then here I'll also go with 320. I'm going to come up to, let's say, about, I need a 50% roll rate. Now roll rate, rotation rate is converted into a rotation position. So if you're rotating at a constant rate, the motion platform is going to sit at a certain angle. And with pitch rate, it's a bit different. The pitch rate, we're sort of using the same residual yaw method that we did in driving mode. The reason for that is that the pitch rate, we actually just want to capture the initial nose up and nose down movement that the aircraft does before it reaches the certain angle of attack. And once it reaches that certain angle of attack, it's going to start pulling, vertical G's. How we model vertical G's is slightly different. Let's just do roll rate first. And right, so at this speed, you see that if I do like a constant roll rate, it just maps it one-to-one to the rotation position. And at high speeds, this is a good effect. Now we'll add a bit of pitch rate as well. So let's go with 50% pitch rate. And oh, sorry, I did not set the speed over there. So this is going to be again 220 and 320. Right, so when I do small nose up, now this is not capturing vertical G's. This is just trying to capture that initial nose up moment. So regardless of whatever position you're in, let's say I'm in a 90-degree bank and I pull the nose up, right? So you see that it captures that nose up, and as you can see now, right, when I leave the stick, there's a bit of an oscillation, and that also captures the nose down effect a little bit. So, right. Now, before we go to vertical G's, I want to show you the washout scales and what those are doing. So for now, I'm just going to set the pitch to 0, and let's start with the pitch rate washout. So I'll set the pitch rate to, let's say, an even higher value. Let's go for 70. And again, these washouts is something you can scale or set according to the airspeed. I generally don't tend to run washouts. For me, this is good enough from changing to pure orientation to rotation rate based effects at higher speeds. But if you want, so let's say, for example, I've set these to 990, so there's no change airspeed wise. And let's go with a 20%, or let's go with a slightly stronger one. So let's see what that effect that brings. Now what's it going to do is, as you saw that, when I was at a constant roll rate, the motion platform was sitting like this. Now with a washout, what happens is that when you enter the roll, it's going to go like this. It's going to follow the roll rate and then slowly bring it back to 0, right? You're still maintaining the same roll rate, but as soon as you leave the stick, it's going to produce a slightly opposite jerk. So now, as you can see, the platform is now coming slowly back to 0. And if I leave the stick, so it gives me sort of an opposite effect. And this could be more akin to, let's say, what effective roll acceleration you're feeling. Again, this is something that you might want to feel, might not want to feel. We give you this option, but I tend to run this at 0. And now let's just turn this to 0 as well. And I'll turn this up to, let's say, 35% to show you the orientation washouts. Again, with the orientation washouts, what's going to happen is you pull up the nose. It first captures the nose up moment, and you're still sitting at this upward scale, but it's going to bring it back to 0. Now, so let's see if I set this to 30, what happens, right? You can also see in the signal that the motion now is coming back to 0. Even though I go like a 90-degree bank, it's slowly coming back to 0. So good thing is you feel the change in motion, and then the motion platform comes back to 0. So for whatever next change you want, the entire range of the motion is available. The slight downside to this could be that, if, let's say, this is coming now back to 0, but now when I go back to my sort of a 0 position, the initial point is this, right? Because now the center reference has changed with the washout. And we've given you a number of things here, and just explaining to you what each and every single effect does, so you can basically set the motion in any way to whatever you want. Then let's get to probably the most important aspect of flight, and that is the vertical G's. What we are doing here basically is that when we get the vertical acceleration signal, we divide the signal into 2 parts. One is a high frequency signal, so that's sort of a heave ripple part, and then there's a low pass, which is the smoothened part of the signal, and this is what we're using for vertical G's. Now we have 3 different presets to reproduce a vertical G's. Let's say, right, so the first one is heave N curve, and with heave N curve, I'm going to show you what we do. I'll set this to 0. I can turn up the scaling a little bit. Let's go up to 50%. Right? So as you can see, it's using all of the heave motion. It cannot create any sort of a constant effect. That is a limitation of flight sims. But this effect really works really, really well with heli sims. And that's, I think, the area where this makes the most sense. For general fixed wing aircraft, what I tend to prefer is the pitch refixed. So we have pitch only. So what pitch only will do is that you have our natural rotation center over here. So this and over here. So that's where it sort of lies. And on this pitch angle, it's going to produce pitch angle based on how many G's you're pulling. Or we have pitch refixed. Now pitch refixed does pitch at a sort of a rear fixed point. And what this does is basically gives your body a bit of a heave and a constant pitch at the same time. So when you're pulling G's, if I go to this and let's see what how that effect looks. Right, so as compared to a pitch only method, which would be, sort of over here, the pitch refixed is now lifting more part of my body up as well in heave. Right now, at the moment, it does not feel as if it's a convincing effect, but in VR, this tends to be probably the most convincing effect. When I was coding the heave N curve, I went under the impression that it's going to be the most convincing effect, even though it's a temporary effect, it's not a constant one. But when you put your VR headset on, the pitch refixed is actually the one that makes more sense. So this is going to put a bit of negative G's as well. Right, and then we do a bank. I think we can add a little bit more of an angle to this. I think we're saturating this effect a little bit too early. So that's something we're going to do in the future updates as well. Right now, so now this part's done. I'm going to set this to 0 again, and we get to layer 2. Now layer 2, as you can see, is we've changed this from layer 2 drive to layer 2 only, because we're using a couple of these blocks which are being shared between the flight mode and the drive mode, and that is the yaw and heave ripple. And we've now changed the name of heave to heave ripple, because this is now more of a high frequency effect that we're trying to capture. Then underneath we have our pitch and roll, which is only for drive, and miscellaneous effects only for drive. The idea was, and this is something that we're going to improve in our future versions, is that as the vertical G's takes care of this, the constant effects, the heave ripple adds, let's say, control surface flutter or turbulence or something on top of it. But what it does tend to do is create a bit of a jerky movement, because whatever heave mode that you're using, it sort of tries to fight it as well. So for now, we've added these knots, scaling in end. And the reason for this is that heave ripple is really important to feel those road textures, to feel touchdowns, taking off and landing helicopters. This makes a lot of sense. And then we sort of tend to blend it out when we get into normal flight. So let's say we don't have any speed-based effects right now. So what's going to happen? Right, so it captures a little bit of that movement. So for example, if I do it in this F18 with a combination of pitch mode, let's say if I add this a little bit, it's not as intrusive. I still feel a little bit of, sort of an uncomfortable spike coming in at certain points. These are things that we actually have to refine in our future updates. And those transitions generally tend to come when the heave ripple signals also is mapping onto the heave axis, and then the vertical G signal, they sort of do cross over. It creates a sort of a mid spike in the middle, right? So because those two signals are being superimposed on one another and then being sent to the motion platform for heave. Yeah, so even in this plane, I would generally tend to blend this out. So let's say I set this to 220. And then, yeah, I'll again go for 330. All of those are settings that I've used everywhere else for sort of blending in my landing and takeoff. Now I'll get to yaw in a bit. What I just want to do is I want to set everything up and show you a nice takeoff with longitudinal G's turned on. So yaw is 0, and I'm going to set these up to whatever I had set before. So let's say we go to 10%, and then roll rate, I'm going to come up to 50%. Pitch rate, I'll also come up to, let's say, 40%. I'm going to set this to 100, set this to 100. Basically, we're doing nearly the same things that we were doing for driving sims over here. It's just that now we have N-curve flight 1, and you can't choose any other effects, so it's going to be fixed to N-curve flight 1, and then we're going to have N-curve flight 2 or 3, just like we have N-curve 1, 2 over here. The important thing is that the outgoing scaling for pitch is already set to 70%. Those high pitch angles that we were expecting from driving mode, we're not using them in longitudinal G-force because we want to reserve our pitch axis, our pitch scaling a bit more for the orientation and the vertical G production. Now underneath we have in surge prediction, we have our takeoff prediction. This is set to 0. I'm going to set this to 10. And this is really important for, say, carrier takeoffs and landings. What happens in generally a lot of these motion platforms is that when you do a carrier takeoff, they just throw you back. And when you get to that back position, that is correct. You get the lean angle, but that transition, as soon as the catapult is released, the fact that you're leaning back and you're being pulled away from your seat is the exact opposite of what you're supposed to feel, as we discussed in the drive mode video as well. Now, when we set this to 10, our motion platform is going to start coming back. It comes back about 13 centimeters, and then once it's released, the initial hit, what you get is purely in surge. For now, we're going to try to create sort of a dynamic effect in which initially we have only pure surge, and then quickly switches to a pitch down moment. And you're also going to see those heave effects. So that's why I've turned the heave as well on. Let's just reduce the center tightening a bit, and this as well. And so, throttle back. Right, so now we're approaching 300 knots, and all of those other effects are sort of blended out, and all of those orientation effects are gone as well. Right, and as you can see, it's only the pure roll angle that's now being captured. Let's do one more takeoff. So this time I'm going to try to circle back and do a landing. It's really hard. I can manage to do this in VR, but a carry landing with a monitor over there is going to be a bit of challenge. If it is a successful landing, you get to see it. If it's not, then we jump straight into the P-51. So we're now on the P-51, and we're going to make a few changes over here. I want to change my heave ripple to from about 100 to 170, because in these warbirds that it's a bit more noticeable than it is in jets. So I'm going to blend this out really fast, but I also want to experience everything that's happening on the road. So I'm going to set this to 0. Then in G-force, what we want is the takeoff prediction strength. We don't need here. And what we want is to set this to 100, and we have our pitch wave fixed as all. Now, when I release this, you can see that because of the lateral g-force and the pitch, there's a combination that's happening because of the propeller movement, the cyclic movement that's being created. This is a bit strong. This is not an artificial effect, by the way. This is just being reproduced by whatever we're getting from the game. So I'm just going to reduce. So if I reduce my anchor flight to 0, that effect now becomes a pure heave signal. So I'll just go with this to 4. So go with this up to 50%, and I'll go with my heave signal also down just a little bit. Yes, and we'll do a bit of touchdowns, and I'll also show you the yaw effect, by the way. Yeah, so let's just quickly talk about yaw before the takeoff. Oh, and my washout set to 0 as well. So now yaw, I'll just set this to 100. As opposed to what we were doing in driving mode, where we were the residual yaw after back calculating from the g-forces, we don't need that here. That's why it's only the actual yaw rate that's coming through. So the 3 things that matter here are the yaw dynamic, scaling, then the yaw smoothing, and the center tightening. Only these 3 are relevant for flight mode, right? Yeah, no, that's a bit more like it with the washout turned off. So so as soon as I turn up my throttle, this vibration is going to go away. Right, and now I'm going to show you a bit of the yaw movement as well. Right, so if I do, Right, I'm just gonna get a bit of airspeed again, and oh, and alright, so right, and regardless of the orientation, right? So even if I'm sitting at, let's say, a really small bank angle, if I do my yaw, so now my yaw is coming out at this yaw axis. Now let's do a little bit of G's. I'm just going to show you a bit more of, the different flight behaviors. Now let's attempt a touchdown, and before that I'm just going to do a full pitch down as well. Ooh. That's when the airspeed gained up and then stronger G effect than you're expecting. Going to be a really short approach with, actually I got my landing gear out already. Showing you the rudder movement, although it's obviously not needed. I'm coming in too high. Let's just do a touch and go. I think that should be enough. Let's do another touchdown. Let's do a really short approach again. I'm doing this on purpose so that you can see the the suspension effects. And as soon as we land, you can see that now those engine vibration effects have started to creep back in. So now in Microsoft Flight Sim, I'm just going to go over a couple of things that you need to be careful about. I'm just going to click this for now, and once we're airborne, I'm going to show you why we're actually clicking this. The rest of the settings I've left exactly the same as they were for the P51, and all of my heave settings, and yeah, so most of this stuff is nearly the same. Yeah, so I'll actually change this a bit lower because I want it to blend out faster. Still getting all of those road effects, but I would like to blend this out, let's say 120 knots. I want the heave effects to come down to 0, and yeah. just try to do a bit of rudder kicks as well. Ooh. Let's circle back. So with Microsoft Flight Sim, the thing that you need to be careful about here is you'll have to see, for example, even with SimHub, what games actually have like a constant G vector that's coming in. So if I just turn this off, and now if I do a bank, you can see that my lateral G signal is going up or going down, just going up in magnitude. And this is something that we don't want, because we don't want that constant vector, the gravity orientation vector to be there all the time. What the game is basically doing is that, so the net force vector that is acting on the aircraft, it just adds this gravitational G vector on top of whatever the net vector is, which, to be honest, is a little incorrect. Like, for example, right now on this bank, I'm not expecting a really strong lateral G-force, right? I'm maintaining my heading. The aircraft is in a bank angle, and I just only expect that this vertical G vector is going to increase, right? Provide you with this button, with this checkbox. Click this, and then you can see that this green line is now slowly back to zero. This is more than lateral G-force, because with lateral G-force we're not doing any rotation. We're just capturing sort of sway, transitional sway effects for crosswinds and stuff. But it does really become a problem when this added vector is superimposed on the longitudinal G's when it shouldn't be, and then and the motion platforms then are going to try to produce the longitudinal G's, even though that net vector physically does not exist. It's just because of the gravity orientation. Now, let's do just a little bit of heli flying. In G-forces, I'm going to set everything to 50, right? We don't expect a lot of longitudinal lateral G-forces in heli flying. Then in layer 2, we have our yaw slip. And then in layer 2, I'm going to leave this to 100% as well. For heave ripple, again, we're expecting much lower airspeeds during takeoff and landing, and because right now I'm in a helicopter that has skids, so it feels really immersive when you do sort of a hard landing on skids. I'm going to set this up to, let's say, 10 to 15, that it only captures those moments when we're coming down to land. Otherwise, in normal flight, we're going to use the vertical G end curve as our dominant force. Again, I don't think we need any pitch rate or roll rate over here. The heave end curve, I'll just set this to, let's say, 50. Right, so let's just do a quick takeoff. After that, I'll try to do a bit of DCS as well. So I can do this and then go back. Right, so now in normal flight, if I just raise my collective up, if my airspeed is above what I said with the heave ripple, I'm just going to get, right, so I get these transitions. And now I'm just going to come over and try to do a bit of a touchdown here. I'm just going to show you Microsoft Flight Sim just a little bit, because this is a little easier to fly. And then when you switch to DCS, again, I must iterate, I'm not much of a heli pilot, but yeah. Actually, I think, you see, when I'm touching down, it actually takes me down a bit much. So I'll try to reduce that effect, maybe reduce the end curve. Let's see if that helps. And that's, and I'll go with maybe a bit lower amount of heave movement, because so much sharper heave, a much sharper heave movement than with so. And what happens if I turn my vertical G down to 0? So there's not going to be any recreation of that G-force. It's just going to be pure. Oh, right. And just try to settle it down a bit strong. What if I go with SimHop? Now a little bit of the SA42 and DCS. I would say, even heli flying, DCS has a much higher, a much better, flight dynamics than what comes out in the motion as compared to Microsoft Flight Sim. But yeah, I'm not a heli pilot. I can still fly planes a little bit, but yeah, heli flying is something that's a bit of an alien concept to me. So, but yeah, that makes for good motion, right? Right, do a little bit of heave, yaw effects, then again, let's try to land over there. I'm using the same settings that we just did for Microsoft Flight Sim. I think I should go a little bit up on the heave and curve. I don't feel the heave effects as strongly as I was in that. So let's just put this up to 70. Um, Again, just gonna try to do some touchdowns. Ooh. One really important thing that I forgot to mention is that when in layer 2 you have to turn on heli mode. So what heli mode basically does is that in general we have our yaw axis that we've programmed to be a bit in front for driving and general fixed wing aircraft. But when you do heli mode, it brings the yaw axis to its 0 position, so the natural rotation point of the system, fixes you to heave and curve, because yeah, you don't need those pitch effects when putting G's in helis, and also adjusts the internal scaling for vertical G's. Now we're expecting transitions of vertical G's, but those vertical accelerations are going to be much smaller than what they are in fixed wing planes. So it just increases the internal scaling a little bit. So that was enough for my heli flying. Now a couple of important things that I missed out in the video is, firstly, in orientation we now have a center of rotation as well. And if I can just open this and show you, so you have a center of rotation 150 and 400, and basically this is really similar to what we did in the lateral G-forces in drive mode. So what this does is that when you have airplanes or helicopters that have higher aerodynamic centers, you can just place that rotation center above. For now, with COR set to 0, the pitch and roll axis height is around where the hips are. So if you set this up, let's say you bring it here, again, when you select your, let's say COR 400, it's going to reduce that 15-degree peak absolute limit to 11 degrees, because now you're going to have a little bit of a less rotation range, because all of those surge and sway movements are coupled with rotation as well. Then let's get to what the steps that we need to improve. As you saw in the heave tuning part, and the heave tuning and the vertical G's part, we probably want to introduce sort of a third layer in the middle. So the heave ripple basically takes care of all of these sort of hard movements that when you make hard landings, or you're landing a helicopter with skids, or you have an airplane with fixed struts, if you slam that on the ground, that captures that initial sort of a thump in a really short movement, then the remaining signal we want to sort of split into two. So when we realize that there's a bit of a pitch rate, we'll give you an option that it does that. For example, the current vertical G modeling, which is for when you're actually pulling G's, and then this middle layer, which captures sort of these floating movements. So let's say you're approaching, you're landing. So let's say you're making an approach and you drop your flaps, and you get sort of an instant push up, or if there's a gust, or if there's a bit of a turbulence when you're coming in for landing. So that captures those heave movements a little well. So let's say what we're doing in heave and curve, but at a slightly smaller scale, and this acts as sort of a middle layer. So what you can do is that this strong heave ripple part, so you can still fade it out when it's not needed, but you still have these two layers to model the heave movements and the vertical G accelerations. Then what we need to optimize more is this takeoff prediction. So this carrier takeoff prediction. What we want to do is maybe introduce one or two more, let's say, models for this, and also allow for a bit of a higher range in surge. So we're going back maximum to 13 centimeters, but what we can see also in our motion telemetry when we map it, that it sort of peaks out at about +6, +7 centimeters. So we want to try to utilize a bit more of that surge range, so it pushes you for a longer period of time forward. Also, in our future motor updates, we're going to try to push our motors up to 550 to 600 millimeters per second based on what's possible. Right now, we're sort of underutilizing our V-bus voltage. If you understand motor control, you'll get to know what I mean by that. And what that will do is you get the surge acceleration phase for a bit of a longer period of time. It's going to help us a bit in our driving mode as well when we come to braking. And speaking of that, there's going to be a landing prediction as well that's going to work in the same way as a braking prediction. It's a bit tricky because to have very reliable markers on when an aircraft is coming to land, what we're sort of right now thinking is that this landing prediction is going to be only for carrier landings, where it makes sort of most sense, because that is when you get a really hard braking surge. At the moment, when you do a carrier landing, it's going to be really similar to, let's say, that COR 400 braking that we were doing in driving mode, because the platform is going to be at its sort of 0 position. But when we add this landing prediction as well to the code, it's going to move forward a little bit, so you'll get a really strong surge back effect when the arresting hook engages. This part, which is going to come in the next firmware update as well. For flight mode, we're going to give you an option of setting a constant pitch down. We have this limitation that the pedals need to be at a certain minimum height. Otherwise, in the pitch down, they're just going to slam against the motion base. Along with that, we recommend that you place your seat at the lowest most position to have the best driving experience. Now, you can place the seat higher. The drawback is that your body is going to be going up with respect to whatever center of rotation you've set. So this option that in flight mode, you're going to set, let's say, up to 3 degrees of pitch down, which is constant. So let's say you select flight mode, and then the motion platform moves 3 degrees downwards. So your seat comes up into a bit of a more upright position, which is also correct for flight mode. And then your pedals go down a little bit. What you'll do is you'll be sacrificing that negative 15 degrees max pitch down to now minus 12 degrees pitch down. But that is minus 12 degrees is still quite a bit of pitch down. You'll experience that yourself. I think it's definitely worth the compromise if that pedal position is important for you. Now, in the next coming weeks, there are going to be some app updates, and these will mostly be related to the compatibility. So let's say we're going to add a bit more games into the drive mode. If you notice that we also have now a rally mode as well. So please use that if you're using any type of rally simulations. That is to protect the motion platform from those sharp transitions that you get in rally mode. So we don't need to update the firmware side. We're just going to be updating the apps. And after the current release for the motion control unit and the motor drives itself, we're going to have a next major update in, let's say, start September or mid-September. And in this, we'll probably have all of these improvements that I just mentioned for flight mode. There are going to be a couple of improvements and additions to the driving end curves as well. And along with that, there's going to be the first major update for our drives as well. So just to keep things consistent, that's going to be a motor version update 1.05 and a firmware version 1.05. And once we've rolled out firmware version 1.05, we're going to do a revisit, a bit of a video in which we talk about all the changes that we've done in drive mode and flight mode. I don't think we need to do a completely separate video because even in flight mode right now, a lot of stuff is working really well. It's just those multiple different modelings of heave that we need to work on. So until next time, and thank you so much for watching.